Hi, this is Tina. I've been wanting to make this video, but I was waiting for after the holidays. It's a continuation of my son Zachary's story, and I had to prepare myself for it because it's very traumatizing to relive the events that I'm going to talk to you about. But it's a very important part of Zachary's story, and I need to tell it to honor my son and to hopefully protect and warn other parents, protect other children, and so hopefully they won't be traumatized like my son and like I was. I'm going to take you back to February the 27th of 2016. My son Zachary had just turned 6 years old on February the 3rd, so he hadn't even been six a month. And he has had problems sleeping for years. We've tried various prescriptions, melatonin quit working, and the prescriptions stopped working. And sometimes he would go days without sleeping. He'd sleep an hour here, hour there, but he'd be up days on end, and that meant I had to be up days on end because I had to watch him. I mean, he's flooded our house when he was a toddler because he wasn't sleeping and I wasn't sleeping and I fell asleep and he woke up and he flooded our house. But anyway, that's another subject. Anyway, his developmental pediatrician told me that she was going to prescribe a new medication that would help him sleep. And of course, I was desperate to sleep and I was desperate for him to sleep. So I didn't do any research on the medication. I trusted the doctors and that they knew what they were doing, and I didn't do any research, and that is I should have. I learned a hard lesson. So she put him on the drug, Abilify, and it was a liquid version because my son cannot swallow pills. And he had probably been on it maybe a week or two, and she had increased the dose because I wasn't seeing any. He wasn't sleeping basically, and she had increased the dose. And February the 27th, we were seeing my son wasn't himself. He was self injuring himself to the point of he was punching himself in the face and head tens of thousands of times. Like he had bruised himself from head to toe. He had started biting. He'd never bitten. And he was biting and biting, like drawing blood, depending on where he would bite himself or you. It might be almost to his bone or to my bone, not to his, but to my bone on my hand. He was banging his head hundreds of times on floors, walls. He never had done this before. And whenever you would try to stop him from harming himself, he would basically attack you. So this behavior kind of started, and I got called to a school 2 days in a row by the principal because he was having aggressive behavior, and I had to come up there and they had to restrain him, and so things were just progressively getting worse. And by the night of February the 27th, and I will tell you that was single worst night of my entire life, and I've had a lot of bad nights. Um, it had gotten so bad that my son he was injuring himself nonstop, and like if you tried to keep him from hurting himself, he would literally attack me and attack his dad. And we had to call 911 because it was so chaotic. We couldn't even get his diaper or his pull up on him, his clothes on him, to get him in the car to take him to the ER to see what was going on. I knew it had something to do with that drug Abilify. I didn't know anything about the drug, but I knew that he wasn't ever doing this stuff before, and something was seriously, seriously wrong. When the police and paramedics showed up, the first thing they asked me is, what what have you given this child? What kind of medications is he on? Has he gotten into something he wasn't supposed to? It was almost kind of like they were wanting to point the finger at us like we had done something wrong. And we just explained to him that we've only been giving him the medicine that his doctors had prescribed, his developmental pediatrician, who sees him for his autism and developmental delays. And we ended up taking him to the children's hospital. It's not in our town, and I'm not going to say the name of it, but it's about 40 miles away. And he rode in the ambulance. I drove the car. Sean went with him in the ambulance. Um, when we got there, of course, I was hysterical, nervous wreck. I was crying. I hadn't slept for days. I was just panicked. My son had kicked me in the face just 45 minutes earlier and cracked my tooth. And he had bitten me on my hand almost down to the bone. And I was panicked. I thought my son was going to die that night. He was so so not himself. It was almost like he was possessed, but I know that he wasn't. I know that that medication had affected his brain and his mind in ways that I couldn't even imagine what it was doing. Um, when I first got there, I had to talk to a social worker, and that kind of started things off bad because she was trying to talk me into basically signing over, rights to him and putting him in a home because, I was never going to have a life, and it was going to be too much stress on me. And I'm like, I'm here because my son has a medical emergency. He's out of his mind right now. I'm not going to talk to you about this. I have no desire to put my son in a home. And, the fact that that was the first thing she wanted to talk to me about it was offensive to me, and it was disturbing to me. It was very disturbing. Um, Zachary had to be hospitalized for 8 days at the Children's Hospital for psychosis. The drug Abilify had made my 6-year-old son psychotic and severely aggressive. And he was acting, harming himself aggressively, harming me, harming anyone who had to deal with him. And he was a loving child. I mean, this is not what his personality was like. This is not stuff that had been going on it wasn't going on before that he started taking that drug, Abilify. Um, my son is nonverbal, and the hospital we were at was not a psychiatric hospital, although there were pediatric psychiatrists that worked alongside, with the hospital. And they basically wanted, the pediatric psychiatrist wanted to send him off to a psychiatric hospital for an indefinite amount of time, um, where like hundreds of miles away, where I wouldn't be able to go and see him or be with him. My son was nonverbal. He was 6. He was equivalent to a toddler. If someone had abused or neglected or molested him, he wouldn't even be able to tell me what had happened. So, under no, I wasn't even considering sending my child off to a psychiatric hospital as a 6-year-old nonverbal child by himself where I could not go. I mean, honestly, I was afraid I would never see my child alive again if I did that. And I was afraid bad things would happen to him, and I would never know if he did come out of the hospital. We had a local psychiatric hospital that they tried to get him into, and they refused to take Zachary because he couldn't talk, because he was nonverbal. So that was like a slap in the face, because the reason my son cannot talk is because he was disabled by 40 vaccines. And now he's in the hospital for psychosis and severe aggressive behavior because of a pharmaceutical drug that should have never been prescribed to a 6-year-old little boy. I found out that the drug Abilify is a schizophrenic medicine and it's an antipsychotic medicine. Well, if you put someone who is not psychotic on that medication that's not schizophrenic, it will make them psychotic. And that is exactly what happened to my 6 year old son. It was terrifying, it was traumatizing to him, to me, even to my dogs. I mean, my dogs were freaked out that night. So back to the hospital. When I refused to allow these pediatric psychiatrists to send my son either to the Dallas Fort Worth area, Houston, or Austin area, or San Antonio area, they threatened my parental rights and basically kind of were letting me know that they had a lot more power than I ever realized that they did. They were threatening my parental rights. I'm his mother. I gave birth to him. And they were threatening my parental rights just because I was trying to protect my son and do what was in his best interest. And they didn't like the answers that I had. And of course, I told them, your doctors made this, this disaster by prescribing a medication that should never be prescribed to children who are not schizophrenic. And y'all are going to be the ones who fix this problem. I'm not going somewhere else. We're not going to be someone else's problem. Your doctor did this. He's staying here, and y'all are going to take care of this problem where it's a local hospital for me so I can drive back and forth, because I have indoor dogs and I was having to make multiple trips a day, drive back and forth. It's 40 miles one way, back and forth to the hospital from my house to the hospital, just so I can let my dogs out, feed them, give them fresh water, get clothes so that fresh clothes, take a shower, because I was up at the hospital so much. I had to change, I had to take a shower and stuff. Anyway, Zachary was in the hospital in basically I want to call it a net cage, more or less. It was a bed that was like netted where they'd zip him in and zip him out so he couldn't get out. He couldn't hurt himself, and he stayed in this bed, and it was really, really traumatizing to Zachary and to myself. And the 8 days he was there, he continued to punch himself in the face and head, to bite himself, to bite us, hit us. It was complete madness and complete chaos. I was driving back and forth, like I said, for 8 days, multiple times a day, from my house to the hospital, so that I could take care of my dogs, but then so I could also be at the hospital for my son. And on the 7th day, basically I believe it was the pediatric psychiatrist, told me that if I did not agree the next day, which would be the 8th day, to release Zachary from the hospital, even though they didn't have his medications figured out or worked out, and he was still harming himself and harming others, that they would take away my parental rights and I would have no more say in his medical care. And that scared me really, really bad. So even though I was afraid to take him home, or afraid for him to be released from the hospital, I was afraid I was going to lose my son if I didn't, and I might not ever get him back. Because once they're in the system, they can do all kinds of things, and I don't have money to hire attorneys to fight that. And I don't think that the state or doctors or any government entity or child protective services or any of these people will make the right choices for my son. I love him. I carried him in my stomach for 9 months, and I've taken care of him every day of his life since then. I'm the one that needs to be making his medical decisions, and it really upset me and scared me that they kept threatening my parental rights. And I didn't even realize anything about parental rights, but I realized after this tragic event that doctors and particularly psychiatrists have way too much power. And not only can they make your life a living hell, but they can cause, legal problems, can cause problems with CPS. They can they can have your kid taken away from you. I had no idea. I trusted this system since the day when my son was born, and they disabled him with 40 vaccines. And then I've tried to take him to all the doctors and specialists to try to help with his autism and to help with his mild seizures and the different things that have come up and behavior issues. And I trusted the doctors, for that. And they're prescribing dangerous pharmaceutical drugs that should never be given to a child. So I took him home on that 8th day, even though he was still hurting himself and hurting me, and they didn't have the meds worked out. I picked him up at the hospital, and I drove to the pharmacy to try to get his other antipsychotic drug that they had prescribed, and it was called Zyprexa, and it wasn't helping. It was basically making him a zombie, but I thought I better get it just in case I needed it. Even though I wasn't comfortable with a 6-year-old on an antipsychotic drug, I didn't know what to do. I've never been in this situation before, and I had no help. By the time I got home and got Zach inside, it probably wasn't 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, and there's a knock at the door. And it is Child Protective Services, because they had received a report. It was obviously false allegations from the hospital that I'd been at, and he had been at for 8 days, that I had abandoned my disabled son there for 8 days. I had abandoned him there, when in reality, I had driven back and forth 40 miles one way, back and forth multiple times a day, every day, for 8 days. I was there so much the security guards knew me and would walk me to my car late at night. The nurses knew me. The doctors, even if though they changed out and stuff, a lot of them recognized me. And I was constantly, pulling Zach in the wagon around the hospital floor, on the floor we were on, just to kind of keep him, happy, so he wasn't in that bed cage the whole time. But basically, they lied about me and said that I had abandoned my son that I love with all my heart at that hospital for 8 days. And so then I had Child Protective Services in my life, and anybody's ever dealt with them. You do not want them in your life. They are not your friend. They do take children away from loving parents who are not doing anything like abuse or neglect or anything like that. They do it, and they do it for a profit. So I learned the hard way. Not only can you not trust the medical system and the doctors, but you do not want Child Protective Services in life, and you cannot trust them. They do not do what's in the best interest of the child. I don't care what they tell you, they don't. They may have I've learned since then, in the past 2 years, that they make profit. They make